God's Nomen. Today's daf is daf Yud Tes, and we're dealing with the sugya of Big Day Kahuna. And Abaye on daf Yud Ches Amid Beis derives the conclusion that in certain places of the body where there's a lot of perspiration, it's very important to make sure that there's no problem of separating the Big Day Kahuna from the body itself. And the Gemara quotes a brisa that the Kohanim had to wear a chagora, a belt, and the positioning of the belt on the body was very critical. And you'll see on the top here of Daf Yud Tes, Keneged Atzile Yedehem, which means that the belt would be parallel to the ends of the elbows. And the brisa quoted on Daf Yud Ches Amud Beis says, Lola mala me'atzilehem, lola mata me'atzilehem, not above that area or below that area. And the reason for this is that the belt should be parallel to the elbows, to the bottom of the elbows, and that was the daf of yesterday, the discussion, to avoid a place where they perspire. So in other words, the belt that was worn by the Kohanim should avoid being worn on an area in which flesh rubs against flesh. So it had to be positioned in a way to prevent the Big Day Kuna from becoming soiled with sweat. Orav Ashi, Omeli Huna bar Nasan, Zimnin Chad Havikaim. This is an amazing story here. He was this Huna bar Nasan was standing in front of a king of Persia by the name of Izgedar. Halavai we should have in Iran today kings like this Izgedar. Vahavi midli li hemyoni. And it seems that his belt was way too high. And Viteste Niale, the king actually pulled down his belt so it'd be lower on his torso. The Amrali, and he said to him, Amleches Kohen v'goy kadosh ksiv b'chu. Unbelievable. The king of Persia is quoting scriptures and telling him that you are like the Kohanim. And if you're like the Kohanim, then it behooves you to present yourself in a priestly splendor. It includes positioning the belt properly in an area of the body that doesn't perspire excessively. And this is another example, and there are many, of the fact that every Jew has to see himself as a Kohen. That's why we wake up in the morning and we wash our hands like the Kohen before he goes in to do the avodah in the Mikdash. And that's why we consider our shulchan as a mizbeach, as if we're serving on the mizbeach. And what else did I want to say? Okay, there are other examples that just right now don't come to mind. Kiyase kamoi the Amemar omoli. When I told the story to Amemar, he said, "Akayim bach v'hoyu malachim omnayach." So this is a fulfillment of a prophecy in Yeshayahu and Navi that during Yemos HaMashiach, the kings of the non-Jewish nations will tend lovingly to the needs of the Jewish people. Tanan Hosom. Okay, now we have a Mishnah in at the end of Masechta Eruvin. Kohen shaloko betzbo. Now the question is, if a Kohen has to bandage a wound on his body, then the bandage itself will separate his bigdei kuna from his body, and we said that the bigdei kuna have to be directly in contact with his body. Korech oleha gemi b'migdash. In other words, this story happened on Shabbos, and there's an Isur Refuah on Shabbos, and therefore you're not allowed to put a bandage around a wound if that bandage will cure the wound because of the gzeira of refuah on Shabbos, mishum shchichas samaman. But in Migdash, when the Kohanim are doing the avoda, we have a principle of ein shvus b'migdash. So all these harchakos, which the Rabbanan made, that on Shabbos you shouldn't take medicines, they don't apply to the Kohen who's doing the avoda. However, there is a limit to how far we could go to allow putting this bandage made out of reeds, onto a wound that's on Shabbos in the Beis Hamikdash. Im lahotzi menu dam kan v'kan osur. Even in the Beis Hamikdash, it's osur if somehow this retia, it's called in modern Hebrew, but the this reed grassy thing that he puts on his wound will extract blood, and that's called meleches chovel, which is a tolda of netilas neshama. Now, I'm not exactly sure of the reality here, exactly how this bandage, so to speak, will remove the blood from the wound. I don't know exactly how that works. Maybe simply because he ties it tight. I don't know. That I'm not sure about, and he doesn't seem to help me here. Omar Rabbi Yehuda Breid Rav Chia. Lo shanu elo gemi. When did the Rabbanan allow the Kohen to wear this bandage of reed grass, which is called gemi or gemi? That's only because the reed grass is not a beged unto itself, so that although he's wrapping this around a wound in a place where he's not going to do the avoda, so it doesn't separate his bigdei kuna from the avoda, but nevertheless there's another problem here, and that's called yitur begadim. And this was a sugya on Daf Yud Ches, that you're not allowed to add an extra beged. And therefore, avol tziltzil katan, if he wraps around it a small belt, havi yitur begadim, then he's adding another beged to the bigdei kuna. He's only allowed to wear 4 begadim. Now he's adding a 5th. However, Rabbi Yochanan Amar lo omru yitur begadim el b'makom begadim. If you wrap something around your nose or your forehead, that's not yitur begadim, says Rabbi Yochanan. Yitur begadim means you wrap it exactly where the bigdei kahuna are worn. So you have a 5th beged. Avol shelo b'makom begadim lo havi yitur. The Torah did not prohibit adding an extra beged in a place that is part of the body that's completely removed from where he wears the bigdei kahuna. So the Gemara says, I don't get it. Your issue with a small belt is yitur begadim. Typically mishum chatzitza. Isn't he doing the avoda with his hand? And if let's say his right hand, and if he's doing the avoda with his right hand, now his hand will not come in direct contact with the carbon. And the belt that he's wearing is going to serve as a chatzitza, which in fancy English, which is way beyond my English, is called an interposition. Interposition means that it separates. Like if you go to a mikveh and you have a chatzitza that separates your body from the water. So the Gemara offers the following answers: Bismol, inami shalom b'makom avoda. It could be that he's going to put this belt around his left hand. He only does, and he's only allowed to do the avoda with his right hand, or possibly there will not be any contact between, even on his right hand, between this belt that he's wearing to cover his wound and the rest of his hand. Let's say, for example, he would put the belt on the outside so that his hand on the inside comes in direct contact with the, with the clay shares, whatever utensils he's using for the avoda, the mizrak, and so forth. So that's called on the back of his hand. Upligi de Rava. Now, Rabbi Yochanan was assuming that if the extra beged is not anywhere near the rest of the begadim, there's no yiter of begadim. But Rava says, Amar Rava Amar Rav Chizda, b'makom begadim afilu nema achas chotzetzes, shelo b'makom begadim shalosh al shalosh chotzetzes. So again, according to Rava, even shelo b'makom begadim, there is a violation and a psul of yiter begadim. However, that's only if you put something that has the basic shear, the size of a beged. It constitutes a beged, which is called gimel al gimel etzbos. Right? You take the thickness of the finger and you multiply it by 3. And if it's the mokom begadim, then afilu nema achas chotzes, the smallest amount, even a hair, will constitute a chatzitza, but shalom makom begadim, then the only chatzitza is if it's gimel al gimel, and then it has the status of a beged l'kol dini Torah, like for example to be makabel tuma. And pachas mikad, if it's shalom b'makom begadim, then if it's less than 3 by 3 etzbos, then it doesn't constitute a beged, and therefore there's no iser of yiter begadim. So again, you sing here a brisket tzvei dinim. There's one din of chatzitza, and that applies to wherever he's holding the kli. And then there's a din of yiter begadim, and Rava says that if you're talking about a chatzitza, it doesn't matter where on the body it is. It could be far away from the big day kuna, but if you're talking about adding an extra beged as a problem, then it's got to be within close proximity of the begadim, and it's got to be a minimum of a sheer beged, which is gimel gimel etzbos. On the other hand, you could say that even a small belt, as we discussed before, if it's b'makom begadim, then it's considered yiter begadim, even if it's less than 3 by 3. So ad Rabbi Yochanan vadai pligi. Okay, but now, although Rabbi Yochanan certainly disagrees with Rava, or the other way around, because Rabbi Yochanan says there's a problem of yiter begadim b'makom begadim, and it doesn't matter what the size is, even a small belt. But the Gemara now wants to go back to Rabbi Yehuda Berei, to Rabbi Chia, who spoke about a small belt as a yiter begadim. So lema de pliga, should we say that Rava is disagreeing with Rabbi Chia? Or shall we say maybe shani tziltzil katan de chashiv? You don't need, even according to Rava, 3 by 3 in order to constitute a ribui begadim. The whole purpose of 3 by 3 is to generate a shem beged, but here the chashivus of a tziltzil katan, insofar as I guess it functionally it adds something important, that generates chashivus. You don't need 3 by 3. Lishnach relay. Now we have a different tradition as to what was transmitted here. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Breder Lo Shanu Ella Gemi Aval Tziltzil Katan Chotzetz. V'Rabbi Yochanan Amar Lo Amru Chatzitza V'Pachos Mishalosh Al Shalosh Ella B'Makom B'Godin. So it seems that now Rabbi Yochanan is on board with Rava, and if it's Makom B'Godim, then if it's very, very small, it's not a Yiter B'Godim, but if it's already got the shear of a beged of 3 by 3, Ava Shalom Makom B'Godim is Shalosh al Shalosh Chotzitzos. Pochas Mikan, Eina Chotzetzes, V'hainu de Rava Amar of Chizda. So now the Gemara, according to this tradition, is reconciling Rabbi Yochanan with Rava. And in a case of less than Sholosh al Sholosh, if it's Shalo b'Makom B'Godim, then you really don't have a problem, a serious problem of Chatzitza, unless it's Sholosh al Sholosh. So again, when we talk about chatzitza, it's not really a full-fledged chatzitza because it's not separating his body from the avoda, from the kli. Ahainu de Rav, fine. Lema pliga de Rabbi Yehuda, berei de Rabbi Chia. Now, we should certainly come to the conclusion that Rava rejects Rabbi Yehuda, who said that even a small belt is prohibited, presumably even if it's less than gimel al gimel, and even if it's shalo b'makom b'gadim, but shiny tziltzil katan d'chashu. Ul Rabbi Yochanan mai irya gemi lashme'ina and tziltzil katan. Why mention this reed grass thing to be matir? Why not tell me a bigger chiddush? Why not tell me a chiddush that even a small belt, which is not gimel or gimel, is permissible? You're telling me that reed grass is permissible. Tell me even a better chiddush. And the Gemara answers, Milsa Gavurcha Kamashmal, and now Rabbi Yochanan wanted to tell me something about health. The Gemi Masi, that Gemi, reed grass, has a curative effect. And therefore you could not apply it to a wound on Shabbos because it's curative and it has a din of refuah, but in Migdash, it's mutter. Boy, Rava had the following suffix. Nichlasa lo ruach b'begodo mahu. Let's say wind, air, gets underneath his begodim and separates the begodim from his body. Al b'saro be'ino, we need an actual contact between his basar and his big dekuna, which he doesn't have, and therefore apostles. V'holeka, o dilma derech levisha b'kach. What should we consider that the Torah doesn't mean you have to have a negia between his big dekuna and his body? All you need is he's got to wear it kiderech levisha. And what's considered derech levisha? That from time to time the wind will blow. Another suffix, kino ma'u shetachotz. Would a kina, a small bug, constitute a chatzitza? Mesa loti boilach, if this louse is dead, then vare chaitza, certainly it's a chatzitza. But chayamahu, what's the status of a live louse? Miyamrin came with the Yosef, since it comes and goes, revisa hi velo chaitza. Revisa means like something natural that comes and goes. It's not a chatzitza. Chatzitza has to be something that's totally foreign to the body. Oh, Dilma came into kapit Allah chaytzi. Or shall we say no? Even though it's very common and natural, but nevertheless he's makbid. He doesn't want, any louse on his body. Another suffix, afar mahu shiyachutz. We're talking about earth before you made it into dust. Afar vadai chayitz. The Gemara says, you know what? I wouldn't even raise this question. Certainly earth is a chatzitza, El avak ofam. What if he takes the earth and he pounds it down to making it dust? Is that a chatzitza? Another suffix. Beis hashechi mao sheyachotz. What if he has in it right after his arm is placed into the beged of bigdei kahuna? There's a certain distance or airspace between his armpit and the sleeve of his bigdei kahuna al basaro be'inon. Now he's not touching, that part of his body is not in direct contact with the big with his body. Well, I mean his body with the bigdei kahuna. O dilma, or should we say derech levisha b'kach? Once again, this is the way you wear it. Hichnis yad l'tocheko ma'u. What if he takes his hand, the Kohen, and he puts it into his chek, his chest? Is gufo michayitz olo? In other words, does one part of the body serve as a chatzitza to another part of the body? Right? Because his yad is a part of his body. Let's say he takes his left hand and he puts it here, in a way underneath the begodim. So the begodim are now separated from his body. Or should we say no? His hand is also part of his body. I think we're up to number 6. Nema mao shetoch. Right, the Gemara is unaware of what we said before, that a dead louse is certainly a chatzitza. So the Gemara points it out again, as if the Gemara was not aware of it. Nema vale chaitzi. Now the Gemara is saying that a nema, because he's makbid on this louse, therefore it certainly is a chatzitza, even though the louse is alive and it comes and goes. Ella nima midudelis mahu. Let's ask a different question. What about you have threads that are coming out of the bigdei kahuna and they're sort of like hanging, like when you buy a suit or a shirt, sometimes you'll very often find, some threads that are hanging out. Boy mar baravashi yotza saro bebigdo mahu. What if he's got long hair, the Kohen, and the hair separates the begodim from his body? Sa'aro kegufo dami. If we assume that in the case where he put his arm in, the guf is not separated by another part of the guf, that's not a chatzitza. Here too, the sar, the hair, should be viewed as an extension of his body. O lav kegufo dami, or is it a separate element, separate entity? Boy Rab Zera, tefillin mao sheyachotz. What about the tefillin shel rosh are on his head, and he's doing the avodah while he's wearing his tefillin? Might not be such a good idea. Because the Gemara says, "I'll leave it to man the yom alayla lavs man tefillin hu lo tiboilcha kevan de belayla chaytzi yom nami chaytzi." Now this is a very, very difficult, a very profound svara that the Gemara is saying. At night, when the Kohen would wear tefillin, for sure those tefillin would be a chatzitza. But the mitzvah of tefillin, when it applies, might neutralize the chatzitza. If we hold that there's no tefillin at night, then tefillin at night become a chatzitza, and therefore the Gemara says that tefillin even by day also are a chatzitza. Now, what does the day have to do with the night? He says that there is avoda that's performed at night. We thought that the Beis Hamikdash is closed for business at night. That's not so. There are hekter chalov and veivarim. There are different things that the Kohen has to do, avodas haKohen at night. And once we paskin that the tefillin are a chatzitza at night, then memela that carries over into the morning. Although there is reason to argue that the daytime wearing a tefillin, which is a kiyum mitzvah, should not be viewed as an additional garment, or according to Tosfos as a chatzitza. Nonetheless, the Gemara maintains that the restrictions that pertain to nighttime avodos, ipso facto, apply to the avodos performed by day. Why that's so, we're not sure. And the Gemara explains the suffix mitzvah de begufei chayitz or lo chayitz. Now, it's because he's fulfilling a mitzvah that itself makes it like part of the big day kahuna? Or should we say no? It still remains a chatzitza. This suffix came in front of Ramami. Amalei Talmud Aruchu Biyadenu Tefillin Chotzetzes. The tefillin is a chatzitza regarding big day kahuna, and therefore the kohanim would not wear tefillin when they're doing the avodah meisvei. The Gemara raises a contradiction to Ravami. Kohanim b'avodasam. I'm assuming that this is a brisa, and Leviim b'duchanam, v'Yisrael b'mamadam, p'tur min hatfila u'min hatfilin. Now the Gemara is medayik the following. We're saying what's called an exemption. An exemption from the mitzvah of tefillin that applies to kohanim while they're doing the avodah. An exemption, not a prohibition. They could wear the tefillin if they like, but they're not obligated to wear. The Leviim, when they're doing their avodah, which is either misharim or mishorim, and Yisrael b'mamodim, they have to be standing over the korban, ke'ilu, to supervise the korban. All these three categories are exempt from tefillah, from davening, because osek b'mitzvah potu min ha-mitzvah, u'min ha-tefillin. Osek b'mitzvah potu min ha-mitzvah applies to tefillin as well. You and I would have said, well, why knock off tefillin? I mean, tefillah is a time-consuming effort. But tefillin, you could be mekayim the mitzvah of whatever mitzvah you're obligated in while you're wearing tefillin. In any event, the bottom line is that there's a p'tur. P'tur means that they don't have to, not obligated to wear tefillin. But im hi nichan, it will be fine. Ain't a chotzetzes. You see, the tefillin is not a chotzetzes. No, the Gemara says im hi nichan chotzetzes. In truth, the tefillin are a chatzitza. Okay, why do you tell me that the kohanim during their avodah are exempt for the mitzvah tefillin? They're prohibited in tefillin. It's a chatzitza. So Gemara says, "Keva de ikol aviv v'Yisrael delo mitnu le asur." Right, with regard to a Levi who's playing the instruments in the mikdash, or Yisrael who's doing the mamodos. In those cases, there would be no prohibition, because there's no dini chatzitza by wearing tefillin. And therefore, it's only a p'tur. There's no isur. So the brisa couldn't have said asur, because if they wanted, they could wear tefillin. Both Leviim b'shiram and Yisrael b'ma'amodim. So again, just to reiterate, since in the case of Levi and Yisrael, they had to use the word p'tur, the word asur would not be appropriate, because there's no issue of chatzitza with regard to singing songs or standing on the mamados. And therefore, already in the case of kohanim, he mentions p'tur, even though really the technical word should be asur, because it's a chatzitza. Frek Gemara, for Tanya meinichem einam chotzetzes. How much more explicit can you be than that? The Brisa says that if he put on tefillin, it's not a chatzitza lo kasha, ha diyad, ha derosh. In other words, the chatzitza problem is in the tefillin shel yad, and the reason for that is because he does the avodah with his yad, and any chatzitza on the yad has to be excluded, has to be gotten rid of. But in the case of that second brisa that says that tefillin are okay, that's a case of tefillin shel rosh, and tefillin shel rosh does not form or establish any sort of chatzitza in the avodah. And for sure, there's no yitur begadim here. Oh, he writes something a little different than what I said. He says that the tefillin shel yad are a chatzitza between the ketones and the body of the kohen. Not the way I said it. That's chatzitza to the avodah biyad. Yilbash al b'saro. There's got to be a direct contact between his body and the big day kuna. Shelo yedavar chotz beino leveino. Oops, sorry. To Rosh Namiksiv, let's darshan the same thing in the pasuk by Shel Rosh, as it says. Is this also? One second. Now the Gemara is going over to a pasuk in at the end of Shmos. Before we were focused on a pasuk in Vayikra. So how are you creating a consistency in the way you're interpreting the words of scriptures of the Torah? Here it says mitznefes al rosho. So therefore, you should have a similar problem, a parallel problem, if you're wearing tefillin shel rosh, just like in shel yad, because the tefillin shel rosh will be a chatzitza between his head and I'm sorry, and the mitznefes, and the, what's it called in English, the mitznefes, the turban. So the Gemara is going to reject this question by quoting a brisa. Tana sa'oro hayudnira bein tzitz lemitznefes, so that the tzitz is one on the forehead, the mitznefes is on the head, and in between he has hairs coming out of his head. And that's not a problem. But the brisa adds 3 words here to justify why is it that the sa'ar between the tzitz and his mitznefes is not a problem. Shesham me nicham tefillin, because that's where he's going to wear tefillin on top of that hair. Anyway, it's quite clear that the tefillin are not a chatzitza in that spot. Okay, now we start another sugya within Big Day Kahuna.